Hi everybody, and we'll get on to Hebrews 11, part 2. Just finished part 1 10 minutes ago, so had a little break, had a cup of tea. Now I'm going to start in verse 23. Poetry even. I'm going to start in verse 23, where we look at the faith of Moses. So it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer afflictions with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, but also of David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Amen. So, picking up from Moses, in verse 23, we know that his parents hid him for 3 months because he was a beautiful child. They saw that he was favoured by God, and they took measures of faith to save his life. When the Pharaoh of Egypt commanded the murder of Hebrew children because there were simply too many Hebrews, faith gave Moses' parents the courage to obey God. Now Moses, when he was grown, showed faith in letting God chart his destiny instead of just sticking with Pharaoh or letting his ambition do it. Now, this choice had consequences because Moses knew that to go God's way meant to suffer affliction rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of Pharaoh's palace, the pleasures of sin. He probably didn't know it at the time, but the persecution he suffered for his choice of serving God and his people put him in the company of Jesus, who suffered to set men free. Moses' natural eye could see the danger from Pharaoh, and he understood the danger of remaining in Egypt along with the Israelites. And yet his eye of faith could see him who is invisible. And he understood that God was a greater fact in his situation than an angry Pharaoh was. When Moses led the Passover, it took faith to believe that the blood of a lamb on the doorpost would save a household from the terror of the angel of death. How much faith did it take, do you think, to take a lamb and to kill it, get a bowl full of its blood, get a bunch of hyssop, and do as you're told, just to smear the blood on the doorposts and the lintels, and say, that'll keep us safe. We'll be okay in here now. The angel of death can go around all the Egyptians, but we'll be fine. But Moses had that faith, and he led the nation in observing the first Passover. And then they came to the Red Sea. And the difference between the Israelites crossing the Red Sea and the Egyptians crossing was not courage, but faith. The Egyptians had as much courage as anyone, but not the same faith, and they each had different faiths. The Israelites came through, the Egyptians were drowned. I move on to when Joshua is taken over as leader of the people of Israel, and he comes to Jericho just after they've crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. That in itself took faith, because the priests were commanded to carry the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders and to step into the water whilst the Jordan was in full flood. Noah and I, we've been to Israel, we've seen the Jordan in full flood, and it's a big river. And these priests could easily have been swept away, but instead the water was piled up at a point further upriver, and the riverbed became dry, and so they walked across. Then they came to Jericho, and the people of Israel there, they had an obedient faith because they did exactly what they were told. They didn't really understand what God was doing, but they obeyed just the same. And they had a patient faith, and the walls didn't fall down on day one. It took 7 days, and yet they kept marching as God commanded, round and round the city of Jericho. They also had an anticipating faith. They knew that God would act on the seventh day when they shouted it. Sure enough, when they raised a great shout and when the trumpets were sounded, the walls of Jericho collapsed. Joshua 2 tells us of a rather unusual example of faith, Rahab the harlot. Her willingness to become a traitor to her own Canaanite gods and to identify with Yahweh, despite the cost, is worthy of praise. We know that when the Hebrew spies came to Rahab, she declared, "He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." That's proof of her faith. It was not strong faith, and it certainly wasn't perfect faith, but it was commendable. And our writer goes on to say, "What more shall I say?" And he gives us a list of heroes of the faith. He gives us Gideon, who boldly destroyed idols and was mightily used of God to defeat a much larger army of Midianites. And yet, when we first see Gideon, he's a man who doubts God's word and is hiding in a wine press. See, Gideon repeatedly asked God for confirmation. God was good enough to give him that confirmation. Barak, in the book of Judges, led the people of Israel in a dramatic victory over the Canaanites, but he hesitated and would only go out to fight when Deborah, another judge, went with him. We have Samson, who was used mightily of God, and yet he never lived up to his potential and had a tragic ending to his life after being led astray by Delilah. Jephthah was used of God to defeat the Ammonites, and yet he made a foolish vow that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house, and it turned out to be his daughter. David, a remarkable man of faith, and yet he sinned with Bathsheba, and he failed with his own sons. Each of these are men of faith, yet they have notable areas of failure in their life, and still Hebrews 11 puts them in that great hall of faith. It shows that weak faith is better than unbelief, and you don't have to be perfect to make it into that hall of heroes. Now we look at some of the prophets, and by faith some were victorious over circumstances. Some subdued kingdoms, some like David, Joshua, King Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah and King Josiah. Some worked righteousness, Elijah, Elisha and other prophets in general. King Josiah as well was a righteous man. Some obtained promises, and I always think here of Caleb, who at 85 years old goes to talk to his partner, Joshua, his partner, when they went out to spy the promised land. And Caleb says to him, "I'm 85 years old, give me my mountain." Yeah. Gideon, of course, had promises, and so did Barak. Some stopped the mouths of lions. including Daniel and David and Benaiah, one of David's mighty men who decided to jump into a pit with a lion. And he came out again. Some quenched the violence of fire, and of course we think of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Some escaped the sword. David escaped the sword of Goliath and the sword of Saul. Moses escaped the sword of Pharaoh, and Elijah escaped the sword of Jezebel. And out of weakness they were made strong. Amongst these we've got Sarah, Gideon, Abraham, Esther, King Hezekiah. Some of them became valiant warriors in battle. David, King Asa, Jehoshaphat. Women received their dead to life again, the Shunammite woman and the widow of Zarephath. Others were tortured. Isaac endured cruel mocking of Ishmael, and Samson was mocked at the feast of the Philistines, but Samson got his own back. Joseph was cast into prison for faith, and King Ahab imprisoned Micaiah the prophet. Zechariah was stoned to death between the altar and the temple, and Naboth was stoned to death by Jezebel's men. Reliable tradition has it that Isaiah was actually sawn in two and killed. Many were slain with the sword, such as the 85 priests of Nob who were murdered by Doeg, or the prophets that were murdered in Elijah's day. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. Elijah wore that kind of clothes and didn't care about the humility or the discomfort. And the world was not necessarily friendly towards them. People of faith always find it difficult to fit in, or they try not to fit in. It's just that we can't work out where they fit. And the world isn't necessarily worthy of them either. And they've hidden, of course, in the past in dens and caves of the earth. David, Elijah, and under the leadership of Obadiah the prophet, were all forced to flee and hide in caves. We went to En-Gedi, a beautiful spot, and there are caves there high up in the hills. Some of those caves are where David and his men hid from Saul. In the conclusion, we have even more reasons for faith, more reasons to hold on to faith than those heroes of the faith had. All those have obtained a good testimony through faith, but they did not receive the promise, the testimony of the completed work of the Messiah. And if these followers of God were steadfast without receiving the promise, those who have received the promise, as us, have even more reason to continue on through trials and difficulties. The idea of perfect faith is complete faith. They could not be made complete until the work of Jesus was completed. They look forward to Jesus and his work. We look at it from behind and enjoy the fruit of his work. Their faithfulness actually makes our faith a little easier. The writer to the Hebrews begins this chapter speaking of faith in the present tense. Now faith is. By faith we understand. And the end of the chapter reminds us that faith is, and it is for we who follow in the footsteps of the faithful men and women of previous ages. So that winds up Hebrews chapter 11. Thank you very much for those of you who come along and have a look. And just in this time of lockdown, I pray that you will all stay safe and do your best to comply to the government regulations, and hopefully we can beat this thing and get back to a normal life.